and gentlemen, Simon Wilson and Ralf Rangnick from Red Bull. Please welcome them to the stage.
Hello everyone, welcome Ralf. We're so lucky to have Ralf with us today, and obviously you've just seen the video there that explains kind of what we look at when we look at Red Bull today, but it wasn't always like this, was it, Ralf? So you joined in 2012. How did it all start?
I mean, when I got the phone call from Mr. Mateschitz and his assistant in June 2012, he was actually looking for a new head coach for Salzburg. And when he asked me if we could meet, I told him, yeah, we can easily meet, and I would love to meet you, but I will definitely not become the new head coach of Salzburg in an Austrian league with 10 clubs at the time playing against each other 4 times. But then he insisted, and 1.5 hours later we met, because he flew himself with his helicopter from Salzburg to my home place in a small town near Stuttgart. And then we met, we spoke for 4 hours. Gerard Houllier, his advisor at the time, one of his consultants, was also on board. After 4 hours, he asked me, what are we doing wrong in football? Because at the time he had just won his 4th consecutive title in Formula 1 with Sebastian Vettel. And he just didn't understand why in football, in the clubs they had at the time, they were not so successful. And I told him, I mean, to be honest, I would change quite a few things. The 2 clubs, Salzburg and Leipzig at the time, had squads players with an average age of 30 plus. So in a positive way, you could also call them experienced squads, but most of the players in Salzburg, for example, they came from Bayern Munich, or some of the players signing their last contracts well paid. And it was pretty similar in Leipzig at the time, level 4. They had players who had played 2nd division or 1st division before and were on outstanding contracts at the time. So I told him what I would change is the acquisition of players and try to get players who sign their 1st or 2nd contracts in their career. And then within 1 or 2, 3 transfer windows, you would have a completely different motivational setup, because then players would play for very different reasons for the 2 clubs than they did before.
Mm. And it seems to me that it's such a good fit between Red Bull, the organisation, and you, the individual, and what you stand for. Why do you think Red Bull identified you as somebody to lead their organisation moving forward?
I mean, as I told you the story, they were not really looking for me to become the new as he tends to call me, the mastermind or sporting director, because at the time he was trying to sign me as a head coach. But after those 4 hours, in the end, he offered me the job as a sporting director for both clubs, Salzburg and Leipzig. And for that, you must know that I lived in a small place near Stuttgart. And from Stuttgart to Salzburg, it was 350 miles. From Salzburg to Leipzig, it was 400 miles. And from Stuttgart to Leipzig, it was 350 miles. No direct flights between the venues. Okay. So it was not that easy for myself to organize my personal life and my professional new job between those 3 venues.
You didn't get the helicopter?
No. And to be honest, I couldn't be at the same place at the same time, so I had to delegate and to organize things in those venues. And the first 12 months after I decided to accept this job, it was club building all over the place. So in the first 12 months, we just made sure that the 2 clubs had a setup which allowed them to be successful in the following years.
So what types of things would come to mind when you think about club building and making sure the 2 things are set up for success? What sort of things are you talking about when you talk about that?
In 2012, the head coach of Salzburg was Ricardo Moniz, a Dutch coach whom you might have heard of. And at the time, he more or less threatened his players that if they don't follow his advice, if they don't do what he tells them to do, he would be sent to the East German exile in Leipzig. And he meant that very seriously, and the players, that was the worst threat that he could speak and tell them, listen, oh no, please, I don't want to go to Leipzig of all places. So that just should show you how the two clubs, they had nothing to do with each other apart from the initials RB. So they were really not even opponents, but they shared nothing together. So for me, it was very logical that we should try to implement a setup where the two clubs could benefit from each other. So the first thing that we did was trying to create a setup in the scouting department where we were looking for the same kind of players. And in the first 2 years, as long as Leipzig was still level 4 or level 3, it was easy. So for example, when we scouted Sadio Mané in Metz, who were just relegated from 2nd division in France to 3rd division, it was not so easy to convince him to join us. But in the end, after we had convinced him to join us in Red Bull, it was very easy that he could only go to Salzburg because he would never have been transferred from a 3rd division club in France to a 4th division club in Germany. Yeah. And the same was true in the first 2 years. It only became a little bit more difficult once we had reached 2nd division level. And now with 1st division, it's clear if we have an outstanding player, if we have scouted an outstanding player, he would want to go to Leipzig rather than to Salzburg. But again, at the time, 2012, we had to make sure that we could create synergies between the two clubs. And for example, the scouting department was one of those synergies we were trying to create.
Mm. So when you talk about the style of play, or some people call it philosophy. I know you like to call it style of play or the corporate identity of the football team. For the people in the audience, could you just explain in your words what that is, so that we can get a feel for how you think about the game?
I mean, my idea or my style of football was influenced in the 80s. As a young German coach, I mean, I took my UEFA license in 1981 at the age of 23. I was probably the youngest ever who took the coaching license in Germany. It was very difficult as a German coach to find some sort of role models or mentors within the own country. I mean, we in Germany until the year 2000, we were, I would even not call it famous, but rather infamous for the German virtues, for fighting hard, and against Germany, you have only won when you sit in the bus on your way home, all those kind of things. But we were not famous for strategies, for tactics. And this changed in 2000, 2002, through coaches like maybe myself, Jürgen Klopp, Thomas Tuchel. This changed. And but at the time, in the 1980s, you had to find other mentors, role models. And for me, it was Arrigo Sacchi and Valery Lobanovsky at the time. With my first club in my home city, we had a friendly game against Dynamo Kiev, and I was a player's coach at the time, and after 10 minutes I started to count the players on the pitch because I couldn't believe how much they put us under pressure. You never had the time to control the ball, and it felt as if all 11 players played at the same time against yourself. So I counted players and found out that both teams had 11 players on the pitch, and then we lost the game 6-1. And after the game, I could speak with a translator, with Valery Lobanovsky, and he told me about his idea of football, pressing all over the place, all over the pitch. And from then on, I went to watch their training sessions. They were on the preseason camp in Stuttgart. And the same with Arrigo Sacchi. I mean, you know the time with Milan at the time in the 80s. I mean, he was playing perfect ball-orientated zone marking. At the time with the offside rule, because at the time offside was offside. And those two coaches really influenced my style of football and my career. And in Germany, until 2000, we played in a 3-5-2 with 2 man-to-man markers, with a libero. In fact, Franz Beckenbauer created that position for himself. And this only changed again in 2000, 2002. I mean, Franz even said himself, or other German coaches thought tactics is only for if you have poor players. I mean, I never understood that. Franz Beckenbauer said, with the back four, you cannot play with German players because they are too stupid to play in the back four. So I never understood why Italian or Swiss or Austrian players should be more clever and more intelligent than German players, but just to show you where we were at the time. And gladfully things have changed in the meantime. So what I brought into the company of Red Bull were 2 things where we are a little bit different to other clubs. Number one was a style of football. I don't like the word philosophy, but I would rather call it a style of football, which is completely independent from the formation in which you're playing. If you're playing in a 4-3-3 or in a 4-2-2-2 or in a 3-5-2, it's got nothing to do with the form. The formation has got nothing to do with the style of football. Our style of football is very proactive. We try to have influence on what's happening on the pitch, no matter if we have the ball ourselves or if the opponent has got the ball. So, in fact, to make it the long story short, it's very similar to Jurgen Klopp's Liverpool style of football, always being proactive. The second thing, and this is what I brought into all our clubs, the style of football, no matter if it's the under-12 team or the first team. And the second thing is that we were only looking, as I said, signing players with a first or second professional contract, that we were only looking for young, highly talented players. So the younger, the better. For us, to be honest, the 23-year-old is no longer a talent. But if we could sign players like, for example, Sadio Mane at the time, Naby Keita, when we signed him, he was 19, playing for Istres, another third division club in France. And the younger we get the players, the better it is for us. And we are not. If an agent calls me and offers me a player at the age of 28, I don't even put down the phone and say, no, we are not interested in those kind of players. And in those two areas, we are a little bit different to other clubs.
There's one thing about having a style of play or a philosophy as a coach. The second thing is implementing it. And to do that well, you need the support of the organisation that you're working for, but you also need to be able to sell and convince other people that your way is the right way. Have you had any challenges along the way in terms of implementing your philosophy across the clubs?
Yes, we had indeed, because our first competitive game, I mean, when I signed my contract, that was late June 2012, and most of our competitors had already started training. So I needed to find a new coach for Salzburg, obviously, because Ricardo Muniz had just left. And we also needed a new head coach for Leipzig. So I had to find new head coaches within 2 or 3 days. I decided to sign Roger Schmidt, who at the time was the second division coach, pretty unknown in Germany in Paderborn, and Alex Zorniger, because in Leipzig it was a little bit different. As I said, we were level 4. In the first 3 years, our dressing room was a container. So right now we have one of the most modern training centers in Europe, but in the first 3 years between 2012 and 2015, we were living and getting changed in containers. So I needed to find a coach for Leipzig who was ready and willing to coach a fourth division team and bring it to at least second division within 2 or 3 years. And the same was the case with players when we were looking for new players. So with the two coaches, I had within 1 week we found an agreement with the two coaches. And 2 weeks later, we had our first Champions League qualifier against Dudelange, Dudeling in Luxembourg. So with our Salzburg team, we played Dudelange. And we lost 1-0 away at Dudelange. And a week later, we won the second leg 4-3 and dropped out of the competition due to the away goal rule, 4-3. And as you can imagine, Mr. Mateschitz, he was not amused and he was not very excited about that result. And he then spoke to me, but for losing against Dudelange, we wouldn't have needed to sign 2 German guys, one as a sporting director, the other one as a head coach. So he was not so positive about that. And if I look back to those days, whenever we met, we had an argument at the time. We were standing nose to nose and arguing. So it took a year of club building, of changing things in the academies, bringing in best people, best men for each job, or best women for each job. And it took a year until even the boss realized that we are on the right pathway. And I mean, nowadays, whenever we speak and meet, he fully trusts us in our way we deal things. And right now, he's the best owner, to be honest, that you can have as a sporting director or in my new role, because he fully trusts in what we are doing.
In your career, you've spent a lot of time at the top end of the game, but you've also spent a lot of time at lower level as well. And you've had 2 significant projects in your career, the Hoffenheim story and the Leipzig story, where you've grown a club from the 3rd or the 4th division and taken them all the way through to the Bundesliga or the top division. For the people in the audience here that are managing their own projects, what do you think is the first principle? When you're building a project, what's the first thing that you want to do to get right, to establish, to allow the journey to continue?
I mean, in the beginning, it needs a vision. You need to have the vision, what can happen. I mean, if I think of my days in Hoffenheim, the game before my first game as a head coach and sporting director, in fact, in Hoffenheim was with Schalke in San Siro. We played Inter Milan. That was the last game before I had my next game with Hoffenheim. And in Hoffenheim it's a village. It still is a village. It has a population of 3,000. So it's probably the smallest club in the top 4 European leagues. So when I went there, for me, I needed to have the vision what can happen within 2, 3, 4 years if you pull the right strings, if you develop the club in a way that we developed Hoffenheim at the time and Leipzig and Salzburg now. So it needs a vision. Then you need to have the best people on board. And of course, it was very important for me to have a network of people which I could get to know in the last 20 years of my professional career. And then, of course, we had the money available. And so when somebody asked me what is important to develop, probably not only a company in the world of business, but also a football club, it needs and takes the 3 C's. Number 1 C, which some people are trying to reduce ourselves, is capital or cash. Of course, it's helpful if you have some money available. The second C for me is competence. So you need to have the best possible people in your company, and the third one is concept. So you need to know how to do things, and if you have those 3 C's, I think you're pretty well off, and you can have success in the end. And for me, it's probably, if I now look backward into the last 15 years, it's no coincidence that the most successful 2 clubs were Hoffenheim and now Leipzig, Salzburg, because I could influence things myself. And this, obviously, as you can imagine, if you have the privilege to work with top people every day, if you can see them every day, if you know that they are not only top in their jobs, but also nice people with whom it's great fun to work with. And if you can influence the things yourself, I mean, this gives you such a good feeling in your job that, well, I can only say in the last 15 years I've been they have been strenuous, but I've been very privileged to be able to work for those 2 clubs.
Sure. And particularly in your time at Leipzig and Red Bull, in the 7 years you've been there, you spent 2 of those seasons as the coach and 5 seasons as the sporting director.
Yes.
What do you notice about the 2 different roles? What do you notice about the differences between leading as a coach, leading in the dressing room, if you like, and leading as in the boardroom or the overall club? Is it different to lead in those different ways, or are there similarities?
I mean, for me, it was, in both situations, in 3.5 years ago, when we had played our first year in the 2nd division and we finished 5th, and we had to look for a new coach, and at the time I wanted Ralf Hasenhüttl, who had just won promotion with Ingolstadt to the 1st division, but he was not willing and ready to leave Ingolstadt. So I had to ask myself the question, who will be the best possible coach for that year, because I had a very good conversation with Ralf at the time, and he indicated that a year later he might be ready and willing to join us. So for me, the question was who could be the best possible coach for that year to make sure that the team will win promotion to the 1st division. And I decided to take the team myself, knowing that all of the players we had in our squad were signed by myself as a sporting director. So the personal relationship between myself and the players was so close and so good that on the one hand, it was a risk. Most of my friends and my family, they told me, Ralf, don't do it, because if it doesn't go well, it might cost me even my job as a sporting director. Sure. But in the end, I decided to take the job. It was a question, again, of responsibility towards the club, and it went well. We won promotion in that year. And then a year later, after winning promotion, we signed Ralf Hasenhüttl. And then we had Ralf for 2 years. In the first year, he finished 2nd, and we qualified for the Champions League directly. In the 2nd year, we finished 6th. But at the time, I felt that for taking the next steps to become a regular Champions League contender in the Bundesliga, that we might need another step, another development step. And Ralf insisted to sign a new 2 or 3 year contract, which I didn't want to give him at the time. And then he told me, listen, if you don't want to give me another long-term contract, we rather split and separate, so, which we did in the end. And then again, we had the next decision to take. I knew Julian Nagelsmann from my time in Hoffenheim, because when I was the head coach in Hoffenheim, he was the under-16 coach at the age of 25 at the time. So I knew him well enough, and I knew that he would be a perfect fit for our club again. But he had a buyout clause in Hoffenheim only for the year later, and had just qualified for the Champions League with Hoffenheim. So we knew that we could get him, but only a year later. So we had the same decision for myself to take. What are we doing for that 1 year? Should we bring in another interim coach for 1 year? How likely would it be that he might become a lame duck in that year, because everybody knew that Julian Nagelsmann would be the new coach a year later? So I had to take the same decision again, and again, most of my friends said, please don't do it. So I decided to do it again, and in the end it worked out well again. We finished third. We played in the cup final against Bayern Munich, and now with Julian on board, we can take the next steps. He's only 32. He's, for me, probably, if you bear in mind how young he still is at the age of 32, he's one of the best and best young coaches we not only have in Germany, but probably in Europe.
And I imagine for a coach coming in, you having done the role, having walked in their shoes, you have a lot of empathy with their challenge, their situation, and so forth, which should, in theory, make you a better sporting director. What do you think coaches look for in a good sporting director? Or what do you think makes a good sporting director to a coach?
I mean, in fact, from my experience in the last 30 years, and even more so in professional clubs, all the people for me are service providers. Our job is to make sure that the 25 professional players in the first team can develop in the best possible way. And no matter if it's the sporting director or the bus driver or the head coach, who is the most important person in the club, or the kid lady, their job is to be service providers and make sure that the players can really develop and put their full focus on getting better. And I tend to compare, I mean, it's difficult to plan success. So to plan to win a championship, or even more so a Champions League title, or winning a World Cup tournament is difficult. I wouldn't say it's impossible, but it's difficult. But what can definitely be planned is development of players. This can definitely be planned. And suppose development of players consists of, in a jigsaw of 500 pieces. We tried in Hoffenheim, Leipzig, Salzburg to have all 500 pieces in our portfolio, no matter how at first sight how irrelevant they might seem. So even if it's only a very, very small piece of that jigsaw, we tried to have them available for the players. And in the end, it's up to the players if they want to take that little piece, if they are willing and ready to invest into that or not. So just to give you an example, nutrition. So when I came to Salzburg and Leipzig, don't ask me what they were offered after training or after game day. You wouldn't want to know that. And we changed everything. So in fact, we not only scouted kid ladies or kid men, we also scouted chefs, we scouted cooks, we scouted video analysts, everything. And now if I look at our players in Salzburg and Leipzig, how well they are, how much they are professional players and taking care of their own career and development of their career. This is really something very exceptional. This is probably part of the secret behind the success, that we could convince the players that this pathway makes sense to develop their own careers.
You've got a new role. You started in the summer, looking at things from a global perspective. Do you want to just give us a background to your new role and what you're trying to achieve with that?
Again, it was a strategic decision. In the winter break last season, At the time, we were fourth in the Bundesliga. I asked myself, does it really make sense after that year? And at the time, I didn't know how successful we would end up at the end of the season. But I had a very strong feeling that it would not be a good idea after that year to go back to the sporting director job again. Because as you know, we bring in a young coach with Julian Nagelsmann, and we all know how media are and how much they would then try to find out who started the communication between the two of them on the pitch. Julian wanted me to sit on the bench. I told him, Julian, this is not a good idea. So if I stayed as a sporting director, I will sit up at the stands. And you know, when that all started, you probably had the same gut feeling that I had a couple of years ago when players started to talk like that on the pitch, or head coach to assistant coach were talking like that. At first I thought, did they go to a Greek restaurant and eating some garlic? I didn't know why they were doing that. Now we all know why they did that, because they were afraid of reading their lips, what they're saying. And I told myself, I will never speak to one of my players or to one of my assistant coaches like this. If this happens, I'm no longer the right person for that job. So I want to just speak frankly. So I decided at the time not to go back to the sporting director job. That was one of the reasons, because I wanted my new coach, Julian Nagelsmann, to develop without some sort of a shadow of myself.
Sure. Yeah.
That was number one. Number two was that I asked myself the question, with the global team, at the time we were just about to buy a new club in Brazil, in Bragantino, who were just promoted 2 weeks ago from Serie B to Serie A. And I asked myself, do we rather find somebody else for the global role who can help to develop clubs in Brazil and New York, or do we rather find a young sporting director to be my successor in Leipzig? And for me, the answer was clear. We rather find somebody that, as we did with like Markus Krösche for my job as a sporting director, and I could then put my full focus together with my global team, with Paul Mitchell, with Lawrence Stewart, with Lars Kornetka, with, again, top people in their jobs. They are the best in their jobs, and make sure that the two clubs in New York and in Bragantino develop in the best possible way. Because if we manage now, in my new job, my job is to make sure that those two clubs can get to a similar level than the clubs in Leipzig and Salzburg developed in the last 7 years. And if we manage to do that, if we can find the next generation of Roberto Firmino, of Gabriel Jesus, of Luis Gustavos in the next years, and in a country with a population of 230 million people, this should be possible. If we can implement the best possible scouting department in South America or in Middle America and find those people, make sure that we get them into our clubs at the age of 16, 17, then we might have a situation where we can bring the players to Europe again. We can, on the day we try to sign them, we can show them the pathway to Europe, to two clubs in Europe, or at least to one club in Europe, to Leipzig, and make sure that they take the next step there.
Yeah. Guys, we've got around about a minute and a half left here for questions. We might be able to go over a little bit with a bit of permission from the leaders, guys. But has anybody got, and we've covered a lot there in terms of philosophy, tactical style of play, to leadership, to youth development. I'm sure some of these areas are touching on parts of your world. Is there any questions that anybody in the audience would like to pose to Ralf?
I still owe you an answer to the question, sporting director and head coach, the two jobs. For me, as a head coach, and as I said, and I think we all agree on that, the head coach is the most important person in the club to make sure that you're as successful as you can be in the next game and in the whole season. So for me as a sporting director, it's important that I can assist him, that he can put his full focus on the team and not having to look after things around the team like discipline and all those things. So this is my job as a sporting director. But for being able to do that, you have to be close enough hands-on on the team, which I always could do. But on the other hand, my experience as a head coach also showed me that you should not cross a certain line. So it's clear that the coach has to have the final say in the locker room. He's the boss regarding training sessions and in lining up the team for the next game. As a head coach, you're interested in winning the next game and being as successful as you can be in the current season. As a sporting director, you're more or less driving with a navigational system. I also have to make sure that transfer makes sense in the medium and long-term sense. I have to make sure that the club stays on track and still make sure that they stick to their guidelines and to their convictions. So at times, as a sporting director, you have to have a broader view, a more medium and long-term view than a head coach. But again, if you look into international football, whenever, I mean, in England, there is still not a big tradition to have a sporting director, but this tends to change in the next couple of years. But if you look into international football, whenever a sporting director and a head coach have a very professional, close, trustful relationship, the more likely it is that they can be successful.
We have one question here. Yes.
Gareth, use this here. It's got a microphone in it. Coaches, sporting directors, do you prefer them to be ex-players or rather they not be ex-players?
I mean, the same question can be asked regarding coaches. When I was in the 80s, 90s, a young coach in Germany, it was almost impossible. The only way for a young coach who hasn't had a great professional career as a player like myself, the only way to achieve that was winning promotion yourself, which I did with Ulm in 1997 when we won promotion from the third division with 2 consecutive promotions to the first division, or by being an assistant coach of an experienced head coach, like, for example, Christoph Daum was with Rinus Michels in Cologne. Then Köln sacked Rinus Michels as a head coach, and then Christoph became the interim coach and started to win games. And after winning 2, 3, 4 consecutive games, all of a sudden they said, oh, maybe it makes sense to stick to Christoph Daum, although he only played level 10, like Arrigo Sacchi, by the way. He was selling shoes and played level 10. So in Germany at the time, it was almost impossible as a coach who has not had a professional career to get a job in the first division. And nowadays we have a lot of coaches, like, for example, Jürgen Klopp, who was only an average second division coach, Thomas Tuchel, who had not a professional career himself, Julian Nagelsmann, Domenico Tedesco, name them. We have numerous coaches who are extremely successful without having been professional players themselves. We all know that the only thing that the job of as a head coach or as a sporting director and a player that they have in common is the ball game. It's football. But apart from that, they are completely different jobs. And the same is true in my opinion, with the job as a sporting director. You should have played football yourself, but not necessarily on top level. But you need to know all the aspects of the game. And then in the end, it's a question how much influence you want to take in that job. Are you just the one who looks after the transfers, or are you somebody who will also make sure that the club is well structured and has the best possible people for each department?
I think that's all we've got time for. Ralf, thank you so much for being so generous with your knowledge and sharing all of your stories. Really enjoyed listening to you. Can we put our hands together for Ralf Rangnick?
Thank you.